Great. So again, welcome to all of you. And today I want to spend just a few minutes before our practice time to reflect on what I think are two important ideas related to mindfulness. And that is dualism and also the reconciling third. And I'll explain both of those briefly. So you might notice that as you start to begin to pay attention, especially close attention in the mindfulness practice, that um, you quickly start noticing that the mind divides. It splits experience into opposites, good, bad, self, other, sacred, profane, pleasant, unpleasant. This is all of this is called dualism. Um, that the mind kind of takes sides, this or that, up or down, left or right. And in so doing, it's judging. And the tendency, I think, is to cling to the things that the mind perceives to be pleasant and to resist or reject things that are perceived to be unpleasant. And there's a third reaction too, sometimes of just being kind of disinterested, and not giving anything your attention just because it doesn't seem that interesting. Mine kind of checks out altogether. But it's this dualistic thinking that tends to show up and show up very often. I think it's just part of who we are as humans. And in that sense, it's not wrong. It's the mind's default mode. However, it does present some challenges. And contemplative traditions across cultures recognize this dualism as both a natural occurrence and also the source of our suffering. The wisdom schools across most meditative traditions do not reject dualistic thinking, but rather invites a kind of engagement with it, inviting us to hold the tension until something deeper, something else is revealed beyond simple up, down, left, right. And this deeper thing is what some of the traditions in the mystical traditions and also in psychology, in depth psychology, is what is sometimes called the reconciling third. The Swiss psychiatrist and theorist Carl Jung explored this deeply in his psychotherapy work. He observed that when two opposing forces are held together without forcing a solution, right, wrong, yes, no, then something else can emerge. And it's not a compromise or a middle ground, but it's a transformation, he described it as a third presence that integrates both sides into something more complete, more whole, more unifying. Jung called it the transcendent function, the psychological capacity to hold opposites until that deeper awareness arises. And we hear this, many meditative traditions echo this idea, the middle way or the third thing that's born when awareness becomes wide enough to hold contradiction, paradox, complexity without kind of collapsing around that. Just to make the point maybe a little further, just briefly look at how a few of the meditative traditions speak to this dualism and our ability to move toward wholeness or integration. And Buddhism teaches that suffering comes from clinging and aversion, and that meditation helps us observe without having to divide. Christian mystics like Meister Eckhart and the Desert Mothers and Fathers didn't try to resolve tensions. They surrendered to both faith and doubt, light and dark. One example of that in Christianity is the cross, which itself becomes a symbol of reconciliation, between heaven and earth, suffering and love. In Hinduism, the self is already perceived to be one. And that separation is really an illusion. And through inquiry, the meditator is able to realize this non-dual awareness. In Sufism, love is the path through duality. And it's described there that the ache of longing for oneness becomes the thing that sort of uh, uh, lights a fire in us, that has us seeking union. The Jewish mystical tradition of Kabbalah describes the tree of life as having two opposing pillars, severity and mercy. Yet there flows between them a third middle pillar named harmony. Taoism sees opposites not as a problem, but as partners. It's the yin and yang endlessly interacting. And peace is found in their dynamic unity between the two. And one more I'd just say too, in indigenous traditions, often resist binary thinking altogether. Human and land, spirit and matter, life and death exist not in opposition, but in a kind of sacred relationship, often referred to as a kinship. Okay, so where does mindfulness help with dualism, and how can we practice reconciling this either or thinking? And how can we open up to a kind of a third way, a middle path? And mindfulness does help us recognize the dualistic or binary thinking that occupies our experience or sometimes hijacks our minds, often inhibiting us. And it instead invites us to cultivate this reconciling third by practicing releasing judgment. And in so doing, seeing this space that opens up, which opposites can be, in which opposites can be held without having to be split or suppressed or decided between. We see this too in the research in mindfulness regarding the practice, that it increases empathy, taking another position, not just my view or that other person, but having there be, letting there be through empathy another possibility. So in mindfulness, both the formal and the informal practice, this shows up by us simply observing without judgment, softening that kind of rigidity that sometimes happens in our point of view, and sitting with discomfort, allowing space between the stimulus and response without having to kind of have a knee-jerk reaction, and in noticing those polarities that sometimes show up. So mindfulness doesn't force resolution, it holds the tension. And in that holding, something deeper is allowed to emerge than just either or. The reconciling third isn't something we create, it's something that we make space for. Carl Jung, as I mentioned before, he once said the opposites must be kept apart, first of all. So we do see the distinctions there. So he says they must be kept apart, and then they must be brought together. And finally, he says we must be able to stand between them. And we might understand that being the work of mindfulness, a kind of standing in the middle, waiting, listening, allowing, rather than just jumping to a judgment. And so we practice releasing judgment, if just for a moment or moment by moment. And instead letting thoughts, emotions, sensations just come and go without our becoming engaged, caught up in them, taking a position about them. And when we do get caught up, which we will, um, about that which is emerging as we sit here, then as soon as we become aware that the mind is caught, we do our best to release it and just return to the moment. And in that simple being present, something larger, something whole can begin to unfold. So with that, let's practice together. Let's begin by establishing a relatively comfortable posture, sitting with a sense of groundedness, the feet on the floor, on the cushion, and then also being able to have a relatively upright part of the body, the upper part of the body, so that we're grounded, relatively relaxed, yet also alert. And gently closing the eyes if that's comfortable, or just lowering the gaze down so that there's a kind of softening. And letting yourself feel the weight of the body grounded and resting and pausing. And in that sense, being conscious and intentional about arriving, being present here in this moment. So let the attention kind of drop into the body. Feel the contact points that support you, the chair, the ground, the cushion. And let there be a sense in you, even if things are kind of thoughts are flying or you've got a long to-do list, but let there just for these next few moments be some sense in you that you don't need to be anywhere else. You can practice just being here where you are. And along with that kind of global awareness of the body sitting here, you might also pay attention to the breath. I'm not needing to change it, just noticing this inhale, this exhale, appearing and disappearing. And even noticing the inhale and the exhale as a kind of binary thinking too, in or out. So you might see if there's room to just notice the whole cycle rather than an either or, in or out in the breath, that we breathe in and pause and breathe out and pause, and it's more circular. And when thoughts emerge, just notice them. Let them go downstream. When emotions emerge, just notice them. No need to do anything about them now. And if you do get caught up in an emotion or thought, then just notice that you're caught and do your best to just let it go. Same thing with physical sensations. So that we can befriend, have kinship with our emotions, with our thoughts, with our physical sensations. And in that sense, we can come to a certain kind of rest here. Notice where the mind is right now. Maybe paying particular attention to the dividing, the separating that the mind tends to do, liking, disliking. And just see if you can be with whatever you might consider to be good or bad or interesting or boring. And just let it all kind of be what it is without having to prefer or cling to or reject or push away. And we can kind of put out the welcome mat for whatever shows up. Here's a quote from the Christian monk Thomas Merton. The deepest level of communication is not communication, but communion. It is wordless. It is beyond words. It is beyond speech, and it is beyond concept. Not that we discover a new unity, we discover an older unity. My dear sisters and brothers, we're already one, but we imagine that we are not. And what we have to recover is our original unity. So we have a few minutes. I think rather than trying to have conversation and rush people in their comments, I think if you maybe just use the chat function. If you want to make a comment or ask a question,